Okay, so I'm Christina Toouli. I'm one of the practice consultants at TSM. Most of you will know me. I will have worked closely with you in some capacity over the years. I've been with Touchstone for many, many years, and today we're going to focus on iCAT. So iCAT is Invoice Capture, Automate and Transform. So we're going to be taking a look at this piece of software and potentially how it can help your business. So it's not a training session. I know that some of you already have iCAT in some capacity, you're using it actively, or potentially you may have it in the business but haven't quite started using it yet. And we've got some attendees who haven't seen it before and who are excited about obviously seeing how it can work and how it can fit within their organisation. If you do have any questions, if you could please just pop them in the chat. And then I'll come to them at the end. So I'll do a Q&A session at the end if that's okay. But I think we should be good to go if that's all right. So iCAT, it's an acronym. It stands for Invoice Capture, Automate and Transform. Okay, so we're going to run through exactly what iCAT does, how it fits into the spend management suite, the issues that it addresses, how it works, what's different in comparison to iCAT and traditional OCR technology that's out there. How do I get started, basically? So how do you even use it? How do you go about starting with iCAT if it's something that your business is interested in? So firstly, the majority of you will have P2P or invoicing within the Proactive suite of modules. The screen here does map out all the modules within Proactive. So you've got obviously your purchase to pay elements on the right hand side, which the majority of you will be familiar with, and then you've got your source to contract elements on the left hand side. We're going to be focusing on invoice capture today, and just to make you aware, iCAT itself is not a Proactive tool. It's not a Proactive. It doesn't sit within the Proactive suite of modules that you would have on this screen. So all the other elements are licensed as part of Proactive. iCAT sits outside of there. So TSM have partnered with a third-party company, and we've used their tool, their invoice capture utility, to integrate with Proactive. So we've done our own development work as well, and we're using their tool to read the invoices and bring the data into Proactive. Okay, so it's not a Proactive module itself. It's not something that they would supply you with. It's a TSM utility, Touchstone utility. Okay, Proactive do have a separate offering which we can cover on during a different session, but iCAT is part of our invoice automation offering. There are many ways to get invoices through into the system, to streamline your invoice processing, and iCAT is what we're going to focus on today. Okay, so what issues does iCAT address? I mean, you know, way back we were all processing paper, and you know, things were being received into reception and scanned and emailed across the business, or not even emailed, even just, you know, walked around the business, being stamped, being signed. People were having to check invoices manually. There was no real streamlined process to make sure that the invoices coming into the business were from legitimate suppliers, you know, whether bank details were correct. Obviously, all of this, you know, passing paper around the business delays paying suppliers, and that doesn't benefit anybody. Okay, so iCAT does address the issue where invoices are paid late due to the fact that they have to be checked. There's quite a labour-intensive process for some organisations in particular, where every single supplier needs to be checked before a payment takes place. So that pain can be eased as well with the use of iCAT. So how does it work? So iCAT, in its true form, the iCAT utility captures data that's embedded in the digital document that the supplier will send through. So if you can imagine, a supplier will send a PDF. A PDF is the most intelligent type of document. There are different scales of document types. The PDF is an intelligent document. It has digital data embedded in the background, and that is what's being read. So it's stripping off those labels, the key information, and it's reading that information and converting it and providing you with the data to then register, to push into Proactis where your invoice is registered. Okay, so it's stripping that digital data out of your image, capturing that information, validating it as well. So it's doing some validation before it pushes it through. There's no need for suppliers to actually do anything from their side. If you did want to implement iCAT as a utility or as part of your invoice automation process, there's no need for your suppliers to do anything other than send their invoices to a designated email address. So you would have a specific email address they would send their invoices to, and the process would commence. Okay, there'll be no need for anyone to necessarily print anything or scan anything. There's no need for OCR technology. There's no need for your finance team or your finance users to start scanning pieces of information on documents or, you know, drawing boxes around things to identify where the invoice number is or where the date is. The digital data off of the PDF will be read and converted and processed as the invoice data. So how does it actually work? iCAT automates the registration process of invoices. So currently, if you have Proactis, you will have Proactis. I know our audience has Proactis here. So currently where you have Proactis, your AP team are registering invoices manually. So they're taking an invoice from a supplier. So it may have been scanned, it may have been emailed, whichever method it comes into the business, that's fine. They're taking a copy of that invoice and they are taking the information off of it and they're registering it in Proactis manually. So they're registering the invoice number, the date, the values. They're selecting the supplier it relates to potentially if it's a standalone invoice as well. They're entering the PO number or PO numbers that it relates to, and credit notes as well. We're not restricted to just invoices. This process does work for credit notes as well. So it automates that whole process. It automates the process of registering the invoice. So that first screen you go into when you're registering your invoice in Proactis, that's the automation element. So it will take all of that information off of the invoice. It will validate it as well, and it will register your invoice. It will attach the image to the invoice automatically. And it will also, if the supplier has quoted order numbers, it will also match the invoice to the relevant order numbers supplied. If it's a direct invoice, again, it will register the detail from the supplier's invoice that it locates. And it will be, the invoice will reside inside Proactis for you to then allocate the lines to it. There is a possibility of line detail registration as well with direct invoices going through the iCAT utility. That would be something we would have to discuss with each client and each supplier you potentially wanted to roll it out to. So what does it do? So basically, how the iCAT utility works. Obviously, you'd need an installation, you would have workshops. I'll come back to how we would implement iCAT a bit later on. But the first time you run a supplier through the utility, so you would have provided your supplier with the email address, the designated email address they're going to send their documents to. So they will email an attachment of their invoice or their credit note to that email address. That will then be read and transformed. And the first time a supplier is used through the utility, there is an iCAT maintenance option that you'll have access to, where you can provide the actual Proactis supplier that this document will link to. So you need to basically just link the relevant Proactis supplier to your supplier's document that's come through. You only have to do that once and then you resubmit it. The next time a supplier with that same email address sends a document through to the iCAT email address or the iCAT service, it will know who that supplier is. So that relationship will have been built and there's no need to do that further on. Unless the supplier is sending documents from different email addresses, we can create rules to identify that it maps to the same Proactis supplier. Okay, Once it comes into iCAT, you've linked the supplier, it will start to validate. It will validate whether the invoice number already exists. So it does the duplication checks or credit note numbers, of course. It will validate against what you have in Proactis, also what you have inside your finance system. That's typically what we enable. It also validates the PO numbers. So the PO number quoted on the supplier's invoice, it will check whether that PO number quoted actually exists inside Proactis and it exists for that supplier that the invoice relates to. Okay, if it's not the right PO number, you have the ability to overtype it and then resubmit it. Okay, you do also have the option to reject it. You don't have to process the documents that are coming through, but these are typically the steps that you may need to take when the first invoice comes through the utility for each supplier. Okay, so a first-time supplier, the invoice would come through, you'd have to check the details, make sure everything's been read correct to supplier, and there's a drop down, which I'll show you at some point in a moment, and then submit it through. Okay, this is just a representation of typically what organisations used to go through. I mean, things have moved on quite quickly, so most people don't have a mail room or a post room and things are emailed, but still, we are still seeing some organisation having quite a manual process when it comes to invoices. Invoices still potentially not even coming into finance. They're being sent to other areas of the business where they're signed off, even though the POs have been approved. Invoices are still being pushed around the business for sign off when they potentially have been signed off already by PO approval, and there's no real need to have them signed off again unless there's a discrepancy. So, I mean, iCAT will help with that process. Invoices will be coming in centrally via the designated email address, all into a central point where they can be managed by finance, obviously, or the AP team. And if there are discrepancies at that point, Proactis will farm them out to the relevant individuals, rather than invoices being sent directly to different areas of the business, which again, paper gets pushed around, invoices get lost, supplier payments are delayed. Okay, which is what we want to avoid. A bit more information about iCAT. So iCAT is a cloud-based service, replaces on-premise OCR implementations. So where in the past, some organisations did have OCR technology that would have required an installation internally on-premise of that software. Obviously, you would have had to manage that as well. With iCAT, it's a bit different. So the third-party organisation that TSM work with, the invoices are sent directly to them. Obviously, that's not within your environment, that's outside where the data is stripped off and read. It's then pushed back through, it's pushed in. Once it's been read, that's all they do, is they just read the documents. Okay, the data will then be pushed back through into your environment, whether your Proactis system is on premise or whether it's in the Touchstone cloud or another environment. The data is then pushed through, and the iCAT maintenance utility that does all the validation, that does all the checks, that then pushes the data into Proactis, that's a TSM tool. That's not a third-party tool. They have no access to do anything with your transactions once they've come back in to your environment. Okay, so just to be clear on that, where the boundaries are, the iCAT maintenance tool, where you map your suppliers, where you view the data, the details of the invoices, and you link your POs, that's a utility that TSM have designed. Okay, and that utility from there, the invoices get validated, bank details are validated as well, and they get pushed into Proactis. Okay, so it's very secure there. How it's licensed or charged, an annual subscription fee is charged based on the number of invoices. I think traditionally with OCR, I think you had to pay per document or per page, whereas it's per transaction for iCAT. If further information, obviously you want further information in relation to pricing, then the account management team, Sarah and Louise, are geared up to take your questions in relation to that after the session. OCR systems will require the AP team to scan documents, whereas that's not required here. If you're using intelligent PDFs, there's no scanning involved at all with that process. OCR obviously isn't as accurate as reading the digital data off the document. It's never going to be. But just to be clear, like, you know, we would prefer the most intelligent type of documents to be processed through the utility. You're going to get the most efficiencies and the most benefit from doing that. However, in the event that you did send through a document that wasn't an intelligent document, that had no underlying data behind it, and it was just a print of something that was scanned, OCR technology can be used. So, at that point where the document isn't intelligent and it can't be read using the facility that's available, it can then be OCR'd. Even if it was a handwritten document, then at that point, it potentially could be processed manually by somebody within the cloud team that process the documents. But the most efficiencies will come from an intelligent document, a PDF in its true form. So again, just to reiterate, really, we charge a fee per invoice. It's generally lower, it's priced lower than OCR implementations. Each customer would typically buy a number of credits. They would estimate how many credits they would require for the year. Again, it can be discussed further with our account management team. If you do need to buy additional credits for the year, if you're running low, then that's fine, that can be arranged. Credits can be split amongst different companies. If you've got a multi-company environment in Proactis, then obviously you can manage how your credits are apportioned across the businesses. You may need to have the import gateway, which allows the data to flow through into Proactis as part of an iCAT implementation. But again, we can discuss that with you. An implementation time for iCAT, it would depend really on how much resource you have at your side, how quickly you want the implementation to take place. I mean, you have to allow for workshops and installation time in the test environment and in the live environment. And then it depends really what your plan is and how you plan to roll it out to your suppliers, whether you choose to do a big bang approach and say, okay, everyone from this date, please send all your invoices through to this email address, or whether you plan to phase it. So you might take your 20 most, high volume suppliers and roll it out to them first, make sure that those documents are being received correctly, everything's being read correctly, and then slowly roll it out to other suppliers. You will get the most efficiencies where suppliers are sending documents directly to the service rather than them coming to you internally and then you forwarding them. The utility works best where it knows who the invoice is coming from. If it recognises the email address it's coming from, then it will automatically map it to that supplier. It knows the supplier mapping, and that again gives you most efficiency. It's quicker to process that way than it coming from yourselves internally. And we can talk you through how best to set that up. Okay. So again, how do you start? You would just ask your suppliers to email the PDF to a designated email address or a dedicated email address, which we would decide what that would be with yourselves. Obviously, as part of the design workshop that we run, we would have those conversations with yourself and your IT team. If you do receive any paper invoices, then you can choose to register them manually still if you want to, or you can scan them and you can email them through to the service. But obviously, they're going to be coming from yourselves, not directly from the supplier. Okay, and then you would just wait for the invoices to come through. So if they fail, they'll end up in the iCAT maintenance capture utility where they need to be reviewed. Every new supplier that gets onboarded, their invoice will end up in there until you link them to a corresponding Proactis supplier. But once everything's been reviewed and if there are no validation errors, it will go straight through potentially into Proactis. And that's how easy it can be. Okay, so I have some further slides. I can dip into software just slightly after the slides, but just to take you through some of the areas of iCAT and how the process would work. So this is an example of a supplier's email. So they're emailing their invoice to that dedicated email address. It would typically be in a format similar to this. So your organisation at completeinvoicing.com. It has the subject on it. It has attachments. So it's important the invoices or the credit notes are attachments, and they're not just in the body of the email. The body of the email will be processed as well and attached, but it won't be read as an invoice or credit note. So if you've got a supplier that wants to send multiple documents through, multiple invoices, just attach multiple attachments, put multiple attachments on the email, and that will be accepted. They'll be processed separately. In the event that you do have a supplier that sends a single PDF, which contains multiple invoices, we would have to tell it to learn where the breaks are. So when the new invoice starts. So the utility is capable of learning. Okay, and I'll just show you how that works a bit later on. So it's just sent to a dedicated email address. Multiple invoices and credit notes can be processed in a single email. Non-PDF images can be converted to PDFs and processed. And the data will be read from the images. So the data will be stripped off of the document, the PDF, and it will be read. Where it reads the PO number, so this is your invoice screen in Proactis. So where it reads the PO number for an invoice, it will also read the values from an invoice, and it can push it through for payment. If there are no validation issues, if the invoice matches the purchase order, there are no discrepancies of any sort, you know, if it's been fully receipted, the invoice values and the order values are correct. If there are no discrepancies, then it can push it straight through into your finance system. So it doesn't actually need any touch points from any users. That's if you want to set it up that way. For direct invoices, by default, it won't read any lines, so it can read the information from the direct invoice. It will read the supplier, the invoice number, the date. It will read the values as well, okay? But it won't read the line information. And again, it will stay in a tray. It will have the status of registered. It needs you to action it because you need to add the lines on. There are some organisations where we have got iCAT reading line level detail. So for direct invoices, it does have the capability to also read line information. We would have to work very closely with you to scope exactly how that would work within your organisation, and it might not be applicable to every single supplier, and it would be priced differently as well. So just bear that in mind, that some of these capabilities are possible, but we would need to discuss them further. By default, a standard direct invoice will come through and you will have to register the lines manually. So you do get the most benefit from ensuring the business does raise purchase orders up front. The approvals will happened up front. So that order is just literally ready to be invoiced. If the order's correct, the approval has taken place, the goods have been receipted, an ideal situation, obviously, then when the invoice comes in, it will just match to those values. The PO number has been quoted by the supplier because that was provided to the supplier. If it matches correctly, then it will go through for payment and there'll be no intervention required. Now, this is the iCAT maintenance utility. So the supplier will send the invoices to a dedicated email address that is managed by a third party, and that is outside of your environment. Okay, once the data has been read, it will be passed back and it will run through this iCAT maintenance utility. So every invoice is pushed through this utility, which is a TSM utility. We have written this utility to do all the validation. Okay, so the information comes down, it reads, it has the PDF there as well. It has an image of the document and it shows you what's been read off of that invoice. So for a first time supplier, you would need to check the information is actually coming down correctly. Okay, it will check whether the invoice number or credit note already exists within the software or if it's a duplicate. If it is, you have the ability to ignore the records. There are buttons at the bottom of the screen where you can ignore. You can display the image if you want to see it, see the whole image on the page as well. If the supplier is not recognised for a first-time supplier, you will receive this notification, and then you'll need to link it to your proactive supplier from a drop-down list, and then you don't need to do that moving forward. You just resubmit. If the PO number isn't recognised, then you have the ability to either type in the correct PO number, perhaps the supplier's quoted it incorrectly, perhaps the supplier hasn't entered the right PO number, or perhaps the supplier should have put a PO number on and they didn't, and you know it should require one, and therefore you have the ability to type into the PO number field and then press resubmit. In the event that you have your system set up so your invoices always require POs, but you decide, actually, I want to push this through as a direct invoice, you can take the PO number out the field and you can click resubmit, and it will push it through into Proactis as a direct invoice. At that point, you can then choose if you want to raise a new PO against it, that's fine. If you want to change the invoice template against it, that's fine. That's using core Proactis functionality. Nothing there changes. Okay. You also have the ability to read bank details. So it can read company registration number, VAT number, account number, sort code. It can read that information from the supplier's invoice and it can validate it. If we can get to the information that's held within your finance system, then we can validate against that. And if the details don't match, it will stop within this utility. Nothing is going to go into Proactis if it has failed within here. So this is the gateway that does all the checking. Only once the document has been validated and it's checked and it's 100% correct, at that point will it be allowed to release and be created into inside Proactis as an actual invoice. So you can see all the validation and all the checks that take place. I mean, typically somebody would have to undertake this task manually, day to day. And I mean, if you've got thousands of invoices coming through per month, I don't know whether that would be taking place accurately within a business, but the utility would carry these checks out automatically for you. In the event that it has read information from the wrong place, because it can happen, it can, you know, if the data, the underlying data behind the PDF, if the fields are not, if there's not enough space between them, it might, you know, the invoice number might crash into the date and it might not read the fields correctly. That can happen. If you see on the screen that it hasn't been read correctly, what you can do is you can log a rule set request. So there's a button at the bottom of the screen that allows you to log a case directly with our support department from your system. So directly from your iCAT maintenance screen, if you click rule set request and highlight the relevant transaction, it will open up a window for you where it downloads all the XML, it attaches a copy of the image of the invoice as well, and you can type in your comments to say invoice date is not being pulled correctly or invoice numbers not being read from the correct area of the document, and you can log that as a call. That will automatically log a call on our fresh desk, which will be passed on to the third-party organisation. They will correct it moving forward. So it will learn, they will learn that that document wasn't read correctly, and they will make the correction. So next time that supplier's invoice comes through, hopefully it will be, the information will be read from the correct place. There are lots of settings in the background for iCAT, so you can control, just display these options. You can control which templates the invoices will end up in Proactis. So once they've gone from iCAT, which invoice template does it need to be created on in Proactis? Now, if you've got multiple invoice templates, we can potentially create some logic in the background to tell it which invoice template to use when it's creating the invoice or credit note. Also trays. So again, you can identify what the default tray is that the invoices will end up in Proactis. And again, if you've got multiple trays, we can potentially put logic in to try and work out which tray you want it to be based on. But all of those conversations will take place as part of your workshop before we start building anything for you. Obviously, you'd have a design workshop. OK, you can choose whether to automatically submit direct invoices, whether you want them to be held inside the iCAT maintenance utility or whether you want them to be held in Proactis. You don't have to have things going straight through to your finance system. You might want them held in Proactis. You might have additional reference fields you need to attach to certain invoices, or you might need to review invoices and allocate prepayment fields and information to certain invoices. So we can control how automated we can make this utility for you. There's also a log, a rule set log. So where you're logging changes, if somebody within your organisation has already logged a change request, so if it's pulling information from the wrong place, if somebody's already logged that query with our support team and you try and log the same query again for the same supplier, it will warn you to say, you know, are you sure you want to proceed? This has already been logged. So there's quite a lot of validation in the background. In the event that you don't want to process an invoice that's come through from a supplier, excuse me, you can ignore the record. So anything that gets ignored, you can actually reprocess again if you want to. So if you've ignored it accidentally, then you do have the ability to reinstate it again. And you can report on ignored invoices if, for example, they're duplicates. Or if, for example, the bank details don't match and you decide, well, no, I don't know who this supplier is. I don't know how they've managed to send an invoice through. You know, you can ignore those records, and anything that gets processed through the iCAT utility can be reported on. There's an audit trail. Okay, credits. So you can see when you've purchased your credits, you can see how many credits you've purchased, how you've distributed them amongst your companies. So if you've got just a single company, that's fine. If you've got multiple companies, you can see when they were added. You can see how many you have remaining as well. TSM do get emailed. For the majority of our clients, we do get emailed and notified when your credits are running low, or we get a report monthly so we can keep an eye on that information, obviously. And that goes through to our account management team, who may contact you to discuss further. But there is an audit trail of any credits that are added, when they were added, who they were added by, and obviously, you know, how many are used. The audit report. So you do have the ability to report directly from within the iCAT maintenance utility. So the report as well can be automatically emailed to an administrator. It gives you a full audit of any invoices received, whether they've been ignored or processed. You've got the ability to view that information. You can export it to Excel. So, you know, I mean, if somebody was to ask you within your organisation, how many invoices have you had over the last 3 months that have been duplicates, I'm quite sure it would be quite difficult to come up with a number, but you can see that clearly here. So as your invoices come through into the iCAT maintenance utility, you can categorise them. So there are some default categories there, but you can rename those categories. You can create additional categories as well. And as your data is being processed, you do have the ability to recategorize so that you can then report on information later on. So if things are coming through with invalid bank details, they'll be assigned a category. If the PO number's not recognised, again, it will be assigned a category. And you can report on suppliers that are sending you invoices in without a valid PO number. And then at that point, you can communicate with the supplier and try and improve that process with them. So reporting is obviously quite key within iCAT as well. There is the facility to recently, this facility was enabled to allow you to log into a portal. The majority of our clients are using this. Some of them still haven't implemented it yet, but we are working closely with our clients, our existing clients. So this option here allows you to inquire on the invoices that haven't yet come down into iCAT. So anything that's been emailed from a supplier and been sent, you'll be able to view it. So even if it's being processed or it's hit the third party and it's being processed by them, but it hasn't yet come down into iCAT maintenance, you can have visibility of it. So you have visibility of any invoice or any document that has been sent from your supplier to the utility. Now, if your supplier is sending documents that are not recognised as invoices or credit notes, you'll have visibility of them within this tool, within the Capture External portal. Okay, anything that's not recognised as an invoice or credit note won't be processed. So you won't see it within iCAT maintenance. It won't come down because the service won't know what to do with it. So basically it will be sent back to the supplier. But within the portal, you will have visibility of those documents that don't get processed because they're just not legitimate invoices or credit notes. Okay, so you can see here things that are outstanding, things that have been rejected, what's been processed, what's processing. You can see who they've come from. So you can nominate, I think it's 5 people within your organisation that have access to the portal to view the documents in progress. Okay. And just further on the screen is, I couldn't get it all on one screen, but you can see the originator, so the supplier. So you can also view who the documents were processed or who they were sent through to the utility by, whether they were sent directly from the supplier or whether they're being forwarded from your business into the utility, because it will have the details here as well. So you'll be able to report on that. Additional features, some of them I may already have touched on. Rule set log report displays changes already requested. So anything you need to log, any changes that need to be logged, you can click the rule set button very easily and it will log a case automatically, put the comments in obviously, and it will log a case automatically on our fresh desk, which will be reviewed by our consultants, our experienced support consultants. It will automatically go through to complete. When they've dealt with it, it will come back to our fresh desk team and they can communicate back to you that the issue has been resolved. So the next time an invoice goes through from that supplier, it should have recognised those changes. Okay, it may well come back with something else that's wrong with it, but the process is there to enable you to log things efficiently and quickly. There's an unprocessed documents report. So if in the event that you are waiting for invoices to come down and they're not appearing, it may well be that there's a large document that's blocking. Maybe a supplier has sent through a huge statement, hundreds of pages, who knows, you know, or a zip file or something, but it can show you within this unprocessed documents report, it can show you things that are waiting to come through, potentially that are causing a delay. Okay, you've got the ability to grant permissions to various tabs within iCAT. You probably wouldn't want your whole AP team having access to absolutely everything, so you can restrict as necessary, and it's per company as well. There's also a feature called supplier exclusion. So if in the event that you don't want certain suppliers' invoices automatically going through into Proactis and you want them reviewed, potentially because you know that they come through incorrectly, or you know that they're quoting incorrect PO numbers. So before it hits Proactis, you've got the option to exclude them. So if they do send invoices through, they will always be trapped within the iCAT maintenance utility. So you've got that extra option to review them. And once you're happy with the details on them and you've checked the information, you can click resubmit. And at that point, it will push them into Proactis. So it's just an extra facility to hold certain suppliers' invoices if necessary. Excuse me. So that is the end of my PowerPoint slide presentation. I'm just going to dip very quickly into my demo environment. Now I will need to refresh my screens because it's been sitting here for the last 45 minutes. So this is the iCAT maintenance utility. So this is the tool that would sit on your server. Okay, so here I've got an example of an invoice that's come through. I've got my buttons at the bottom, which, here we go, let me just scroll down. There we go. I can't seem to full screen it here, but those are all the buttons that I have at the bottom of my screen. So if I wanted to display the image in full, I can do so very easily. Okay, and I can close it again. But you can see it reads the information, so it's stripped the information off of the digital document, off of the PDF. So it's read, it knows the supplier description, but it hasn't mapped it to a Proactis supplier. This one hasn't been mapped to a Proactis supplier. Okay, that's my Proactis supplier listing. So once I know who my supplier is, I can select them from the list and I can click resubmit. Before I do that, I need to check all the information is correct. So invoice number's been quoted correctly from the invoice that's been received. It's read the bank details correctly. I don't have an error category, so I can just pick something. Obviously, I can rename this as necessary, but I can recategorize my errors so I can report on them later on. This one's failings because it's saying the supplier is unknown. If I click on a separate one, we click on a different one, no orders like 40040 exist. So that doesn't exist as a valid PO number in Proactis. Maybe the supplier's quoted the wrong number, or they just haven't typed it correctly. But you have the ability to overtype that. So I know within my Proactis system, I've got a PO number for this invoice, and I can just type it in. Okay. In the event that it's a duplicate invoice, you do have the ability to have an extra field to type a suffix into. So if you wanted to still process the document in the event that it was a duplicate, I know this will be a duplicate in my system if I was to process it because it's my demo environment. But if I wanted to process it, I could just put a suffix on there. Obviously, it's just test data I've got here. And when I'm happy with that, I can click resubmit. But the first time a supplier's invoice comes through, you would need to select the supplier from the drop-down box, link it to the relevant Proactis supplier. At that point, it will know the relationship. Any future invoices that come down from that supplier's email address will know which Proactis supplier to send them to. Okay, but it's important that the first time you run a supplier through the service, the information is checked properly. Because if you accept it in that form, then the next time you get an invoice, it's going to think that's correct, when in fact it may not be. If you need to log a rule set change, if the information is not being pulled correctly, you can just click the button. There's the XML that I was talking about. It downloads all the data. It will also attach the image of the document. When you put your details in, you can say, you know, invoice number not being read correctly, and you can click submit. I'm not going to do that. But you can click submit and that will log the call automatically with our support team. If your software has the capability to communicate externally with our Freshdesk system. So there are some clients that have everything quite tied down and they don't have the ability to reach out. But obviously these are conversations that we would have, technical conversations we'd have with you, with our integration team as well as part of the design workshop sessions. But once you're happy with that document, you can just click resubmit. It would remove it from the list. If it came back with an error, now obviously there are services running in the background. If it came back with a further error, potentially it might, then it will be displayed in here. If not, it will end up in Proactis. So you can either have your Proactis system set to release, so they automatically post through into your finance system, or you can have your Proactis system set to just submit so that the invoices that come through will reside within a tray and you can action them manually. So I've got a tray, that one will take a while to come through, but there's just some other examples that I've got here that have been raised previously. So if I just drill down into, let me just find one. Here we go. So I've got one very similar for Gel Studios, and I can just drill down into it. Okay, so I know it's come from iCAT. It has a reference number. It also has the image associated to it. So it will automatically register the invoice in Proactis. It will attach the image and any supporting documentation as well. So if the supplier had provided an invoice and a statement or something else as an attachment on the email, that will come through as a supporting document, which you can view within external content. There will be a button and you can drill down and view that information as well. All the XML is uploaded as well for audit purposes. So all of that is retained on your invoice. Okay, in the event that the invoice doesn't match the PO or the receipt hasn't taken place, it will use core Proactis functionality. That will always kick in. The moment the invoice ends up in Proactis, it's using normal Proactis functionality to deal with the invoice and any discrepancies before it passes through to the finance system for payment. Okay, standalone invoices will reside in the tray. This is actually a invoice with a standalone invoice. It's got no lines on it. So in the event that this is what's come through, it's not matched to a purchase order, then you would go in as normal. Obviously, this information has all been registered from iCAT automatically, but you have the ability to go in as you normally would, search for the items, add them to your invoice and submit them. And if it goes through an approval workflow, fine, but then that will eventually end up in your finance system as well. Okay, so hopefully, I'm hoping that's given you an insight into iCAT, into the invoice capture utility that TSM use for some of our clients. Obviously, invoice automation is a big topic. It's not a case of one utility will, work for the whole organisation. It may be a case where 70% of your invoices are processed via an invoice capture tool, and a certain portion of them might be registered manually still, because suppliers don't have the capabilities to send documents in a format that would ever be read by a utility. You may well have the requirement to download invoices directly from a supplier's website, where they'll come straight through into practice and not have to be registered manually. Or some clients import invoices, or they upload them from a CSV file. So there are lots of options out there for you. The important thing is that you know that there are those capabilities, and you're not just sitting there painfully registering invoices manually when the tools and the facilities are available to you. So please, obviously, just reach out to us and have those conversations. Sarah, Louise and myself are available at any point if you wanted to drop us a note. We can do a specific demo for you with iCAT as well if you wanted to. If you wanted to send us examples of your invoices, we can set up a scenario and we can run your invoices through a demo environment to show you how it would work.